So once again, this episode was stimulated as a result of the inquest report on the tragic, potentially preventable asthma death of a 10-year-old boy. So last week in episode 53, I spoke about one of the major preventable factors that cause asthma attacks and deaths, and that was about excess prescribing of short-acting bronchodilator inhalers, the so-called SABA inhalers, which are usually blue. Today, I'm going to focus on another major preventable factor for asthma attacks. And before I do so, please do listen to podcast number 50, where I describe the inquest findings, which has simulated my current thoughts for GP colleagues wanting to improve asthma outcomes. If you do find these podcasts helpful, please do click the follow button so you'll get a reminder whenever a new episode is published. So following my thoughts on how to reduce excess prescribing of short-acting relievers, let's think about another way that general practitioners can reduce the suffering experienced by people with asthma, also reduce attacks and deaths, and at the same time reduce workload. So while this episode is intended primarily for primary care doctors and their staff, people with asthma will also find this information useful. When a coroner finds in an inquest that someone's death could have been prevented, they issue a Regulation 28 report, which details the findings of the inquest with the aim of ensuring changes that can be made to prevent future deaths. Of course, this applies to the United Kingdom. I'm not sure what happens in other countries. Now, in my experience, these Regulation 28 reports on potentially preventable asthma deaths don't usually result in any national action or any national recommendations for change, particularly regarding child asthma deaths. So in my view, it's really down to doctors to change their practice for the benefit of their patients. Now, I do know a lot of colleagues say they're very busy and they can't focus on asthma, but asthma affects about 10% of your patient population. And in my view, that's a signal that asthma should be one of your priorities and you should really be up to speed with the evidence basis for managing this disease. Some of the potentially modifiable factors identified in many people who have these attacks are firstly excess short-acting beta-agonist bronchodilators, the so-called SABAs, which I dealt with last week. The second modifiable factor involves the preventer drugs, which are also called controllers, which are usually inhaled corticosteroids. The third factor relates to the ability of the person to use their inhaler device. And the fourth is when someone keeps attending the general practice surgery or hospital with attacks. That's another signal that something serious is going wrong and that the person is at risk. So I have discussed excess SABA inhaler prescriptions, and today I'm going to focus on the second modifiable factor which is responsible for asthma attacks, and that is insufficient or no prescription for an inhaled corticosteroid inhaler. Now, the reason why this is such an important risk factor for attacks goes to the basic understanding of asthma. Asthma is an inflammatory disease which in simple terms means that the walls of the airways swell up due to influx of inflammatory cells, such as eosinophils. Secondly, the airways get overstimulated by release of inflammatory mediators, such as histamine, which makes the airways hyperreactive or twitchy, which tightens the airways. And third, the influx of cells into the lumen of the airways, causing blockage of those airways. So these three inflammatory processes, reduce a person's ability to get air into their lungs. So why is it so important to understand this? Well, the drugs that work against this inflammation include corticosteroids. And the safest way to get corticosteroids into the body is by using inhalers, where you get a relatively low dose compared to a corticosteroid tablet. Now, while the reliever drugs in the blue inhalers work against one of the end effects of inflammation, That's, of course, the spasm or tightening of the airways that results from the stimulation by the mediators. These drugs do not work against the underlying inflammation, and that's why it's so dangerous to only prescribe the blue reliever inhalers for people with asthma. So from my experience of examining over 700 sets of medical records when I led the UK National Review of Asthma Deaths, one of the major factors in many of those deaths due to asthma was due to insufficient or no prescription for inhaled corticosteroid. Another factor was that even when these drugs were prescribed, many people didn't request or collect refill prescriptions, and in the case of children, this was a safeguarding issue. That is, where a parent responsible for a child's care failed to collect medication which had been prescribed by the doctor. In inquests into child asthma deaths in the UK since the National Review of Asthma Deaths was published, the fact that these children were not getting the doses of inhaled corticosteroids prescribed by their doctors was a major factor related to their deaths. And this was a factor in that recent death of a child where the inquest was published in December 2023. So what can doctors and prescribing nurses do to ensure their patients get sufficient inhaled corticosteroids to reduce asthma attacks and prevent deaths due to this disease? So the first thing is that since 2019, the international guidance has been to ensure that all those diagnosed with asthma are prescribed inhaled corticosteroids. Previous podcasts have included the different ways these drugs can be prescribed, and that does depend on your local circumstances and availability of the drugs. In the United Kingdom, doctors are fortunate that there is wide availability of these drugs, either in the form of inhalers alone or in combination with reliever drugs. There are three main ways that these inhaled corticosteroids can be prescribed. And the first is that they can be prescribed on their own in an inhaler, which is used once or twice a day. And the second way is inhaled corticosteroids can be prescribed in the same inhaler together with a long-acting bronchodilator reliever. Now, there are two types of these long-acting bronchodilator reliever inhalers. The first type is quick-acting, and the quick-acting one, which is called formoterol, works as fast as salbutamol, so it works as fast as the blue reliever, which is often prescribed. And there are also a number of other long-acting reliever drugs which are not quick-acting. Now, the inhaled corticosteroid in combination with formoterol, that's the quick-acting, long-acting bronchodilator, can be prescribed as needed in the case of mild asthma. And in the UK, that's licensed for people over the age of 12. And it can be prescribed as part of a so-called MART, which is maintenance and reliever regime, that is once a day and when needed for relief. So in these MART regimes, the reliever inhaler is delivered through the same device that delivers the anti-inflammatory inhaled corticosteroid. And that means that whenever the person uses their reliever, they also get inhaled corticosteroid, which will deal with the underlying inflammation, which is causing the symptoms. Now, the inhaled corticosteroid inhalers, which come in combination with one of the other long-acting relievers, these are the slower-acting long-acting relievers, for example, vilanterol or salmeterol, and there are others, and these can be prescribed once or twice a day, depending on their licenses. And in this case, you also need to prescribe a short-acting blue reliever like salbutamol or albuterol for relief. And in these cases, these patients cannot use the long-acting reliever with their inhaled corticosteroid as needed, and they can't use it for relief. These drugs are not licensed for that purpose. So the problem with prescribing the other kinds of long-acting bronchodilators with an inhaled corticosteroid and a blue reliever inhaler is that in many cases, the risk is that people stop taking the preventer and they carry on with only the blue reliever inhaler, and that's the only drug they get for their asthma. So the first way that GPs can fix this problem is by prescribing an inhaled corticosteroid. And so having prescribed an inhaled corticosteroid, the second task for GPs is to ensure that repeat prescriptions are issued and that they are collected by their patients. Because if they're not prescribed or collected, of course the patient won't be taking the drug. So whoever is responsible for overseeing the care of a person with asthma needs to have a system for identifying when insufficient medication is being collected. And conversely, where people are only collecting their blue reliever and not collecting the inhaled corticosteroid which had been prescribed. So collaboration with local community pharmacists could help with both of these preventable situations. The thing that general practitioners can do is to ensure that a post-attack review includes a careful check on whether inhaled corticosteroids were prescribed and or whether they're being collected. As a rough guide, people with asthma should be collecting at least 75% of their prescribed inhaled corticosteroids. So, for example, if the prescription is for an inhaled corticosteroid which contains 200 doses, and the patient needs to take 1 dose twice a day, this would require at least 4 inhalers a year. And that patient should be collecting at least 1 inhaler every 4 months, i.e. 3 inhalers a year. Or alternatively, if the prescription requires 12 inhalers a year, so if it's only got 30 doses where the patient's taking 1 dose a day, or 60 doses where the patient's prescribed 2 doses a day, they would require 12 inhalers a year, and then they should be collecting at least 8 in that year. If they're collecting less than 8, that's an alert, and that person should be called in for a review. Now, of course, sometimes computer prescribing symptoms can raise alerts when insufficient inhaler preventers are being collected or when excess short-acting relievers are being collected. So general practitioners need to have a robust system to identify and act on these cases in order to prevent asthma attacks and, of course, asthma deaths. So in summary, inhaled corticosteroids are essential for treating the inflammation due to asthma, and the blue relievers don't do this. Inhaled corticosteroids should be prescribed for every asthma patient, either as needed in combination with a quick-acting reliever in 1 inhaler, or regularly. And systems should be in place to identify and act in cases where inhaled corticosteroid preventers are not being prescribed or collected. Please do have a look at my website for information on my 7-step plan. This is at www.bigcatdoc.com. And please do let me have any comments by email to asthmaspotlight@gmail.com.